Spring 877. Edra sat at the center of the boat packed full of pilgrims. So many of them had stayed at the Holy Island that it had been difficult to find a place for her to sleep. She had sat on the steps of the monastery, looking out towards St. Cuthbert's Isle, wondering whether it would be safer for her to find a cave until first light until the monk, that Edra believed to be suspicious of her circumstances, found a pile of straw and a cloak under which she could sleep above the horses along with the family who had traveled from Lincoln. The mother had fussed her, on hearing that she had been left behind by her family and made her welcome beside her 3 daughters. But Edra had barely slept. Lindisfarne was land which the monks paid tribute to their landowner, Edra knew. And the landowner was Bibbenberg, and the lord to whom they must pay coin was her uncle Elfric. So there was little sleep for Edra that night as she listened for sounds that her identity might be known and that she was about to be hurried off back to her old fortress home, clutching her father's sword in its scabbard to her body. Her presence would probably even now be reported to her uncle, Edra thought as the grey-gold light of the early morning pushed through the gaps in the masonry while the Lincolnshire family slept. But she had done all she could to act the part of poor, lost girl. She was from C. Hughes's, she had said. Her family were merchants. She had been taught her letters and her father was pious. He had taught her Latin, and with it, the Bible. It wasn't much of a lie. Father Booker had taught her Latin and English, and had indeed told her stories of God's greatness, of his punishment of his people with floods and plagues, and his mercy on the occasion of his sending down his only son to earth. He could be classed as her father, for he was father to all at Bibbenberg. In the morning, when all had been bright and fresh on the Holy Island, as if the night had washed clean the sins of the day before, the abbot who had been suspicious of her landing and her injury, a monk, Ida, had taken her down to the quay, where a fleet of 5 dip-sailed boats were being filled with people, families, all pilgrims desperate to get to St. Cuthbert's Island and feel the awesome presence of God. "You will be with your family soon," Beta soothed, handing a chunk of bread. Edra reached up for it gratefully. It had been a long time since her breakfast the day before and the rowing had tired her. It had been Beda who had held her on his lap as another monk, a healer, had carefully removed the arrowhead. "This will hurt," he had said. "I'll be brave," Edra had played pretense with tears and fear doing the job. And it had hurt, and she had shed real tears. And the Beda had bathed it and dressed it, telling her in soft tones, "We will find your family. Get some rest and we will find it. Your father will know his sword." And Edra had been allowed to keep it, as a form of identification. "Girl," Beda's voice called her to her senses. "The boats are to leave. Will you come?" And with God's help, as the monk lifted her over the edge of the boat, the tide rushing them out away from the island, she would be deep into Pitland before news of her having reached Lindisfarne had been sent to Bibbenberg. 88,888,888. The shoal of boats leaving Lindisfarne were heading northwest into Pitland's Moray River. The white headland ahead stood out against the sky, its green-blue land growing ever bigger as the sun insisted on rising and shining right down on them, as if pointing out their boats, Edra's boat, and then her. Sitting as she was by the young daughter of the Lincolnshire family, she slid to the planked bottom of the boat, wrapping her arms around her legs and pressing her face to her knees, her warm blonde hair spilling over her shoulders like a curtain. The woman of the family leaned over and touched her shoulder, muttering kind words about knowing how she must miss her family. The further eyed Edra's father's sword greedily, and when he tried to move it out of the reach, no doubt to keep it, she held onto its handle with all its might. It was her father's, the monk Beda said, who was sitting on the starboard bench a few people down. "I think she means to take it to him." Whether by the holy man's words, or that there were a few people watching the potential act of a man taking the property of a child, the Lincolnshire man cleared his throat, and leaned back, holding his wife's shoulders and looking out at the seascape. Edra glimpsed at all of this through her hair and vowed, though the monks had put her with this family in the belief it would keep her safe, to be clear of the pilgrims just as soon as they landed. Dusk came just as the headland of the Dee came into view. Edra, who was now sitting next to the mother of this family, feigning acceptance, had been rewarded with a handful of bread. This mother was kind, Edra thought. She had her 2 little children tucked right by her, and had spent a good hour as the boat negotiated the wide estuary, to the landing opposite an isle on which a monastery stood. Indeed, the boat that had piloted them in had come from the small harbor. Clearly, thought Edra, the monks knew one another, and helped one another, and indeed, with the lateness of the hour, their little fleet were guided towards the monastery. A conversation was being conducted, as the pilgrims huddled closer to shield themselves from the biting wind, between the abbot and the monk Beda, who had tended her wounds. Instinctively, Edra bent her head next to the family's younger children and sheltered near to the mother, who stood close to her husband. Eyes like blue chips of ice rested on Edra's father's sword for a moment, as the dimming setting sun highlighted the curling wave patterns in the blade. Edra never knew the name of the sword, for her father had died before she was born, but rather a luckless, nameless blade she had revolvered from the armory, appropriated by Sobrit and recovered by her in her hand than his. Buried in his stomach if he tried to steal it. If Edra had had any cause to remember her thoughts on that dull, cold night, there could be any number of things to choose from. Her first thought on deliberate murder, which might be very concerning in a 10-year-old. It might have been the monastery of Kuldes itself, a dull, turreted, grey stone building, somewhere money had been poured to afford the richness of its construction. Somewhere where the doors were flanked by no less than a dozen monks waiting for the pilgrims. Somewhere Edra would get very familiar with in the future. Or it could be that, she thought, as she sheltered into the arms of the woman into whose family she had been thrust, an arrow wound to her hand, she could not trust those in authority to help her. More likely that news of her disappearance would have reached the community here already. Like just now, as the abbot rested his eye on Edra's face, his gaze lingering for a moment too long. When the time was right, she would have to make a run for it, and there would be no better opportunity than the next day, when they would cross the Forth. For the next part of their journey, their walk into Dulriada territory, to the west coast until they reached the sea, then out, to Iona itself, would begin at first light. Plenty of opportunities to lose herself, and find her own way. Especially as she had wealth, tucked flat into her jerkin. "You don't have to be afraid," whispered the woman, against whose arm she had huddled. "You may come with us to Iona, to find your family." The man and the woman were shown a room off the main hall of the monastery where they could sleep, and, like the rest of the pilgrims, were charged a silver piece for food and lodging for the night. The man of the family paid dutifully, before Beda, the monk from Lindisfarne, escorted them to the central hall of the monastery where they were given bread and weak ale. Edra sat eating her bread, ignoring the weevils falling from it as she continued to pretend she was one of the family when she noticed, from the corner of her eye, that Beda was in animated conversation with the abbot, his gesticulation once or twice in her direction. Was he telling the man how she was discovered rowing towards the monastery with a hand wound? Did they know of her uncle? Had he raised the alarm of Gerda's disappearance and these holy men knew of it already? Edra ducked lower again, hoping she was being seen to be penitent and humble. But her mind raced, she must be free of the pilgrim party, and soon. In the cavernous antechamber the monks were at work, fetching and carrying to accommodate their unexpected, lucrative guests. Groups of people were ushered here and there, and the abbot, Bedin, spoke to the father of Edra's temporary foster family. He held out an old, wrinkled hand firmly to one side of the man, who grudgingly counted 4 coins into the abbot's hands. 5, corrected the abbot, raising his eyebrows to 3 children. At the slight hesitation, the man looked at Edra, his eyes narrowing, before flicking to the face of his wife, who bobbed her head for a moment. 5, agreed the man, reluctantly, before the abbot declared his thanks, stepping deftly across the granite flagstone floor. They were led up a set of spiral steps, which opened out into a wide chamber, already filling up with pilgrims from the boats that had been piloted into the monastery that evening. A lot of people sat in groups of 2s and 3s, huddled together, eating, or sleeping. Some, with small children, were nursing them or feeding them. The abbot picked his way through the people, the man and his family in tow. Edra scanned the people for space. Where would they be going? She couldn't see a place empty enough for all 5 of them. But the abbot of Kuldes was not taking them to a space in this room. Instead he was striding to a door at the far side of the room, hand on the iron ring of the latch. He turned it. "It is space for you all, my lord," the abbot said deferentially, his voice soft. The man looked taken aback. "Thank you," he murmured, not correcting the man as he ushered his family inside, his eye coming to rest on Edra's face again. A bed, set to one side of a larger one, was where the two children were to sleep. The young boy, aged about 5, struggled and wriggled in his mother's arms as tiredness overcame him. His sister took his arm and led him to the bed, speaking silent, soft words to him. Edra sat next to the girl, and looking between the woman and Can for signs that she had done the right thing. But the Nan and B woman were now standing by an arched window that looked down into darkness onto the grounds of the monastery below, and further, onto the river, and the Jordan bank of the Forth. Next to the girl, her father's sword beside her, Edra lay, and closed her eyes. 88,888,888. A noise, like a tiny beast scratching its way in the dark on the hunt for food, awoke Edra. Blinking into the darkness, she wondered what shape was ahead of her, that of a shield which, upon its surface, as black as rocks that her uncle had once gifted her, were painted shimmering white dots. Edra blinked, and this time, realized that the dots were not paint, and the shield was, in fact, the outline of the window of the room to which she had been led, with the family she had been given to. She stared at the stars before a shiver brought her to her feet. By the lice-riddled straw was her father's sword, where she had lain it as the mother of the family tucked a thin, wool blanket around her arms. Swords had names, Edra knew, but this sword had belonged to the father she had never known. It had hung between two iron brackets at the back of the armory. She had never known her uncle touch it, or use it. But it had been Sobrit who had, for a joke, placed the sword in her hand one week raid, autumn morning, and had knelt to her, calling her, "my lady." They had guffawed and snorted at her with the sword in hand, taller as it was than herself. And, at the same time that she was being mocked by the guards, Edra had felt a warmth, a rightness from the smooth, iron hilt in her hand. But she had never known its name. To her it was Feathersword, and, at the times her uncle would hit her, for not eating her food, for not learning to sew, for creeping out of her room at night to sit above the chapel and look at the stars. For when not even Father Booker had a kind word for her, she would hold it, swing it, clumsily, feel its weight, feel its ambition, belonging to the father she had never known. It wasn't his first sword, of course. It had been the one he had lost in battle when he had lost his life. When her brother had been lost to them, when she was just a mere baby. Second of everything. It suited her. Second sword, for a second-hand girl, raised for the second purpose in dynasties, a marriage contract. But her brother had been second-hand too. Father Booker had once told her how her father's eldest son, called Dunnottar, had gone to fight against invading Danes and had lost his head. Her mother, who herself was second-hand to Elfric and had to deny Edra's existence, had, once Dunnottar the elder had died, insisted Osbert should be rebaptized as Dunnottar to meet his father's demand that his name be changed. Osbert became Dunnottar, the brother she knew almost like a fairy tale, a legend. "I held him under a little too long," Father Booker had told Edra with a chuckle. "Your mother was most distressed." Oh, that Father Booker was there now to comfort her. Edra knew she would endure his whacks for her disobedience, knowing his strong words would eventually melt to softness. Edra found that her left hand was pulsing now, and stretched it, to ease the cramp in it. Beda had treated her hand again, with the same pungent, sweet-smelling ointment when the boat's passengers set foot before the gates of the monastery. It was healing. More scratching nearby focused Edra's thoughts to her situation. An archway of stone framed a field of stars, which stopped abruptly around an unknown shape in the background. In the foreground, the stone parapet that was the front of Kulji's monastery blocked out more. Pulling the wool blanket to her shoulders, Edra moved across the straw-covered boards. Beyond the monastery, ships disrupted the reflected star field of the river. She would be over that tomorrow, over the river, for the monks were to take them to the castle at Dunkeld before taking the path of the river, and another that would lead them west. Beda had been discussing it on the boat that day, and she, as fugitive from Bibbenberg, had listened with interest. There was a clatter behind her. Edra tensed and swung round. A glint of moonlight played on a pattern of waves, a pattern she knew in her dreams. A tall, vast figure was there, crouching a little as if in triumph, crouching in delight with what he now possessed. Feathersword. At once, Edra leapt. The man with whose family she had been placed held the sword aloft. Moonlight reflected his pleasure at her anger. "It's mine." Edra shouted, not thinking to care if she awoke the rest of the family, nor indeed, the rest of the monastery. Give it back. You're stealing. Just like you did, with this. Thundered the man, pushing her away. This can't be yours, or your father's. You coming from Huiz's. You must have stolen it. Edra made to keep at the man, to get back her father's sword, to recover it. But the words "this brute of a man," still pushing her away, remained in her mind. She had come from Huiz's. Of course she had. So she had told Beda. So she would never likely be in genuine possession of a blade as fine as that. If anyone were to think her noble, then they might start asking questions. A shudder as her mind told her the name Svenk Jotunsen passed through Edra's body. You'd have to be cunning never to eat. A crunch and a scraping of wood confirmed that someone had heard their disturbance. Edra looked quickly towards the door towards the large sleeping hall. Yes, someone was coming in. Unless, the man suggested, a slow smile creeping over his face. The size of it, this took a long time. You come from a noble family, why are you running, who missed you? He leered closer, his eyes widening. How much will they pay for your safe return? Edra said nothing, but jerked her head towards the door, behind which metalware was beginning to be unbolted. The big man followed her stare. It was enough. In a trice, Edra leapt towards him, bearing down as hard as she could with his teeth. At once, the man dropped the sword, which thudded onto the straw. He roared in pain, swiping out towards Edra, who missed most of the blows, though one hand caught the side of her face. She had it. Just as the door opened, the man staggering around after her, Edra ran to the window. It wasn't much higher than the turret tower at Bibbenberg, although it was the middle of the night and she would barely be able to see where she was going. That was if the walls of the monastery were not smooth. If they were, she was done for. Edra tossed her father's sword out of the window. It disappeared into the pitch black of the night, but the commotion in the room as voices were raised, the man's own sharp and indignant above all the rest. Edra felt the masonry with her foot, stretching down lower with her left as she held tightly to the windowsill. Nothing. She couldn't very well go back up. Her arms, for one thing, felt very tired, and Edra doubted that they would pull her back up. She lowered herself down to her arm's fullest length. Surely, there must be something. Above her, shouts. She must hear somewhere. Well, someone find her. Let us hope she is safe. I put her with you because I thought she would be. That was Beda, his soft, cool voice remonstrating with the man. Edra's arms began to weaken as her legs sought purchase with the monastery wall as she fought with her mind to stop her from shouting out. Beda would help her, Edra's mind beguiled. Talk to Beda. But if she did that, she risked being returned to Bibbenberg. Scrabbling desperately at the vertical stone wall, Edra felt liquid ooze from her hand. Pain throbbed down her arm as her healing arrow wound pressed against the windowsill. She couldn't hold on much longer. And then, a ledge, thin, but long enough to reach down to grasp. With ease, Edra pulled herself into the night while the man, who had roused the abbot, stormed about his bite, the voices dimming as she climbed down. Her hand was in agony once she reached the last 20 feet, the moon illuminating the ground, the part-built abbey church towering to her right. More voices now as more people were being alerted to her absence, more hastily shared conversations, more glimmers of candlelight. There was nothing for it, Edra knew, but to make a jump for it. Whatever lay below her would either cushion her fall, or kill her. It was the former. Spiky hawthorns scratched Edra as she landed partway through it and she painfully pulled herself out of it. She would have to run, somewhere. Lights from candles were growing brighter as people made their way towards the abbey's courtyard. It was cold. Edra shivered as she got to her feet. She stumbled, bruising her foot. But the noise of her impact with the object did not go unnoticed in her mind. The clatter meant metal. She scrambled in the darkness for the object, her hand first pulling at something soft, then resting on ... Yes, metal. Her father's sword, wrapped as it had been, when she first threw it down, in her blanket. Taking it up, Edra stalked towards the entrance. The gates bolted. A man ran from the abbey gates, then another, Nuth heading towards them. Edra slunk backwards, her back pressed to the incomplete church walls. Light from the candle showed the man, the abbot now addressing the monk on watch in an animated fashion. And then Edra saw it, just for a moment, as the abbot swung around and strode back towards the monastery, her way out. There was a gap, not 2 feet wide, on the north side of the monastery walls, presumably to aid the masons who were building the monastery's church. She took her chance,